Okay, in this session I'm going to outline to you why you are making a poster and how you're going to put together your poster for your mini projects. So this session is very much about how I put research posters together, and some of the things that I'm going to tell you are my personal preference. I'm going to be marking you, so maybe better stick to my personal preference. So it's largely personal view about what makes a good poster. Other people have their perfect way of doing it. I do mine in a particular way. There is no absolute right or wrong way, but there are certainly some very wrong ways of doing it. I'm going to give you some tips on presenting your poster. I don't know how that's going to work in terms of this particular assignment just yet, but you will have to present your poster in some way. Now, the reason we're getting you to do a poster is that posters are common for both medical and scientific fields, and it's where people go to scientific conferences, they present their results of their most recent research, and the audience wanders around in a big hall. They come to see your work and they come to ask you questions about it. And the way a standard poster session works at a conference when I deliver one is I'll stand by my poster for a set period of time. The audience will come and ask me questions if they think that my work sounds remotely interesting. So to make your poster effective and successful, you need to have it well planned and put it together in a clear and logical way. So my general rule of thumb is if you've got a poster that can be read and understood by your audience in just a few minutes, then that's probably going to be a successful poster. The reason why I say a few minutes is the way conferences work is you normally have lectures in the morning, you then have a poster session which doubles up as a lunch break, and then you've got lectures again in the afternoon. So your poster is competing against a free buffet lunch and unlimited coffee. Now your poster has got to be really interesting to keep a bunch of scientists away from free lunch and free coffee. So you also don't want your audience who's interested in this to have to stand there for half an hour to decipher what's going on with your poster. They want to wander around, see half a dozen posters, make some notes on it, get some ideas, chat to a few scientists, and then go and grab themselves a free buffet lunch. So that's what you're up against. That's why your posters have to be as simple as possible. Now there's a simple format that we all follow. It's easy to follow. Anyone can walk up to your poster. They know where to start. They know where to finish. And I'll give you some examples of my posters. Also, they should be relatively simple, not too much excessive detail. You want people who maybe are not in your absolute expert area to be able to understand. So you don't want too much scientific jargon in there. You want people to be able to come along who are not experts on the specific thing that your project's about, but they should still be able to understand it if they are a decent life scientist. So just like any published research paper, a poster will contain title, and the title has got to be big and bold, but we'll come on to that in a minute. You'll have an introduction section. You may or may not have an abstract, and that all depends on the meeting and how much space you've got. You'll have aims, methods, results, discussion, acknowledgements to funding. You'll also have references on there. So your title, got to be clear. It's got to accurately reflect your piece of work. It's got to be unambiguous. So you want something that's going to have all the relevant keywords in there to bring somebody over to have a look at your particular piece of work. You also need the people who contributed to that project. Just like in a scientific paper, you have all of the authors. You need the authors who've done the work on a scientific poster. Now for your assignment, it's just you. Now this came up in the repro sessions last week. A lot of the posters didn't have a title or a name on it, and that actually made it difficult for me when I was marking those afterwards, and some of the posters had no name, no title, so don't do that. This is not so much for your assignment, but for general courtesy. Research posters, usually the person presenting the work goes first in the list, and your group leader, your boss, your head of research group will go last. So this is particularly relevant if you find yourself as a research scientist. If you did the work and you're presenting the work, you go first. your boss goes last. Last position is probably the most important position. First position is the second most important position. Everybody else goes in between. So that the person who's second on the author list has probably done, apart from being the group leader and you who's done the work, they've made the next largest contribution, and then so on. Okay, your abstract, it should be usually 250 words, describes the work that you plan to do. If it's a scientific experimental poster, you go for introduction, methods, results and discussion, subsections, 80 words or 50 words on each, just like in a scientific paper. Now, again, this is not so much for your assignment, but the general knowledge about how these things work. If you want to go to a scientific conference as a research scientist, you normally submit the abstract of the work that you want to present, and a lot of the big international meetings that research scientists go to are so oversubscribed that a third of submitted abstracts get accepted. So you would write your abstract, you send it off to the meeting, it gets peer reviewed by the conference organisers, and then they will select the ones that are the most interesting sounding abstracts to present their work at the conference. If the work sounds like it's groundbreaking work, you'd be invited to do an oral presentation. If the work just sounds interesting enough to be at the conference, you'd be invited to do a poster presentation. If your work's not very interesting or out of scope, you will not be invited to come and do a poster. Now, that doesn't mean you can't go to the meeting. It just means that, and again, this is just for understanding how scientists work. If you want to go to a meeting, someone's got to pay for it. And the rules in our department is I can go to scientific conferences if I want to, but only if I'm presenting some data. Preferably if I'm doing an oral presentation. My PhD students can go to a meeting as long as they're presenting a poster. If they're not presenting anything, they don't get paid to go. So having a good abstract, well, basically your abstract is your meal ticket into the conference and to get it paid for by your department. So your abstract has to be good. If it gets rejected, you're not going. So your introduction is going to be the next section. It should be a very concise summary of what you are on about. Could include a few references to journals in a very concise format. When I do posters, I normally try and stick to 5 bullet points. So state 5 key facts that sets up the scene for this particular piece of work. And sometimes you can have a few key bullet points and a short diagram to explain a longer signalling pathway. And I'll show you some of my posters in a moment. Now, what we always do in these sorts of posters is outline what the aims are, and sometimes hypotheses as well. So it should be a clear, concise summary of what you want to actually achieve. So a few key bullet points. So one particular study, identify ADAM-TS expression in brain sections. ADAM-TS is just a bunch of proteases. You don't need to know about that. So on this particular poster, it was identify which ADAM-TS enzymes were expressed and then quantify them by Western blotting. So that could just be 2 simple aims that you would set out to achieve. That could also be linked in with a hypothesis. I think on this particular one, the hypothesis was that certain ADAM-TS enzymes would be elevated in stroke or multiple sclerosis, whatever the poster was about. So 2 or 3 clear aims that link to a hypothesis would be a good idea. And what I often do is link my aims to specific outcomes on the poster to actually quickly relay some key important points. So this is on a poster I did many years ago. It was a poster that was looking at prostate cancer cells and stromal cells from prostate cancers. Doesn't really matter. But I got 3 aims, and actually what I did, I linked them up to the outcome. So my experimental aim was to determine whether tumour-derived growth factors induce stromal proliferation. The result was they did. So my outcome is tumour-derived growth factors promoted growth, and I'm linking the reader to figure 1. Now you've got to remember, your reader of your poster maybe wants to read it for 5 minutes. So if you can read the aims, look at the outcomes, and then look for figure 1, they can go, oh yeah, that's what really happened. And then same for figure 2, same for figure 3, and this is the key one of the key points of the poster, so within just a few minutes they'd read my 5 bullet points of my introduction, they'd read my aims, that had led them straight to the outcomes for 3 key points of my poster, and then they could get off and walk away with some good ideas, go to the next poster and get themselves a lunch. But what I found is this particular format clearly defines the aims, briefly explains the outcomes, directs the reader to the relevant results, and it seems to be a really quick and efficient way of putting a poster together. Okay, so on this particular poster, it was one of my MSci Master's students from a couple of years ago. That was the person who did the work, so let's just summarise everything I've done so far. He did the work, Christiana helped out, Rebecca helped out, I was the group leader, so I go last, so that's just reiterating that point. Introduction, we have got effectively 5 or 6 short, punchy sentences, a couple of references thrown in there. We've got a nice just zoom in on that, nice diagram that explains all the key points of the signalling pathway, which would be an entire 2,000 word essay to explain, but we've got that diagram on there, which is taken from my recent review, which is very interesting if you're interested in it. We've got aims and hypotheses on there, so we've got a clear hypothesis: the quiescent cells isolated from lung cancer could be translationally reprogrammed, blah blah blah, and then we've got 2 key aims that we try to do. So that's the point where we're up to so far. I didn't put the aims and outcomes on this one, it just didn't seem appropriate, but sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Now, every poster should have a method section, but this is where this really does differ from method sections that you'll have written for lab reports, is that you really skim down on the detail. It should be kept as simple as possible, so an expert or even just a researcher in the field can get an idea of what you've done, but you don't need every minute little bit of detail. And the reason why is because the person presenting the poster is available to ask technical questions. So if you said, I did this experiment using Western Blotting, the person asking you might say, well, what were the specific conditions of that? What membranes did you use? What wash buffers? And then you can give that person all the tips and tricks of how to replicate your findings, but there just isn't room to do that on the poster. So you have your poster as simple and brief as possible, but giving enough information so that people know roughly what you've done. It's when you publish it as a full scientific paper you'll put more detail in there. So for example, this is from one of my posters. The effect of growth factor stimulation on collagen type 1 levels after 7 days were analysed by Western Blotting using a mouse anti-collagen antibody from Sigma using standard methodologies. So that's what I put on my poster. When I publish this in a peer-reviewed journal, I put all of this detail in there. So on the poster you don't need this, you need something fairly brief like this, but if you're presenting the poster you should be able to explain all of this detail to any person who comes and asks you. Now if you're presenting a poster, let's say for your PSP1, and I have to come round and look at your poster or ask you questions via video casting or however we're going to do this, I will ask technical questions of how you perform the experiment. And I wouldn't expect all of that detail on your poster. I would expect an outline, but I would expect you to know firstly what was done, and secondly how each test works. So then we get on to the really interesting bit of the poster, that's your results section. You'd expect figures and a short summary of your findings in the text, and that would normally be in the form of a figure legend, and a few lines of explanatory text. But keep it brief, keep it punchy to straight observed facts rather than extended discussion of every minute point. You've got to pick out the most important bit. You don't want anyone to have to decipher any complex codes, so if you're presenting something like a gel, have the gels labelled up with what the individual wells mean. Don't label them lanes 1 to 10, and then in the figure legend have lane 1 equals this, lane 2 equals this, because that just drives people mad. And you've got to remember you're wanting to present this poster in 5 minutes. So you want people to immediately see that the lanes for the gels are the treatment groups that you're testing. So on this poster that we just looked at earlier, We've got a results section, and we've got a brief outline, a brief statement of facts. So in this case, A549 cells do not contain a quiescent population, which was one of the aims that we were looking for. And in this case, I'm just making a clear statement that research in the field would understand. So I've got a sentence that explains this figure, and underneath that figure I've got a figure legend giving me some more experimental detail of what I've done to generate this figure and what it all means. And similarly here we've got a section, nice clear statement of the section there. So just resize that. So we've got a nice clear title for the section there, a little bit of explanatory text of what's been going on. In this case I'm trying to identify some drug resistant cell populations. We've now got a nice figure of different cell lines treated with this particular drug. We've got nice statistics shown on there, and we've got an explanatory figure legend explaining all the statistics that we've done. Now on your posters you won't have any statistics, I would guess, possibly not, but this is how we do it in a professional research quality poster. So after your results you want some sort of discussion and or conclusions. So you're wanting to explain what your results mean, and importantly why your results are significant. So just because something happens, well, that can be described in your results, but you want to know what that means for anyone reading this work and anyone working in this particular field. So you don't just repeat your results section, you explain why that is particularly important. And a lot of people outline the future work. Now for a research poster is often a preliminary piece of work that has not yet been published as a full research paper. So you often say, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, the next experiment is to do this. And then that next experiment is usually the bit that's missing that will get you your full peer-reviewed publication. So right down at the bottom right hand corner of this particular poster we've got conclusions and future work. Now this was a very short project, it was a master's 12-week project, and we've outlined that a few cell lines don't contain a quiescent population. That was one of the aims, is to find out if they did contain a quiescent population. So on this particular piece of work we've outlined that many of the cell lines don't contain this quiescent population that we were looking for. We've been trying to generate cells that were resistant to this anti-tumour agent, so we've done that. So we've explained that these lines can be made resistant to this drug. Trail R means trail resistant. Trail is an anti-tumour drug by a persistent subtoxic treatment. And we're also saying that this mirrors clinical findings. And then this is a really important bit about this, is that the trail resistant cells could not be sensitized to trail by this new drug that we were using, but this drug did sensitize most cells. So we're actually identifying that these cells that are resistant to this chemotherapy type agent no longer respond to this one, and that is a very important point, and that's one of the key points of the poster. So this is a very short conclusion of future work, but it's the sort of thing that you might want to have at the end of your poster. A few tips and tricks about how to make a poster look nice. Basically you need to get your point across in as few words as possible. So you need a font that is large and effective. If you've got fewer words, you can have a larger font. If you use bullet points in a short, punchy sentence, you can make your poster be read much more easily. And the basic rule is, if you've got your poster printed out at full size, you should be able to read it from 6 feet away. If you print out your poster on a sheet of A4 and hold it at arm's length, you should be able to see all the detail. And if you can, it's probably a decent sort of size. Now you can tell I wrote this lecture quite a long time ago, because Comic Sans was the in font to use a good few years ago. Arial's probably the best font to use. Comic Sans has got a bit of a reputation for being associated with, well, not the most professional font, so apologies for using it in this. Arial is probably the best. Don't use Times New Roman, it's hideous to read. It's just not a nice font to use. So stick to this one. Probably don't use the one I've used on this presentation. It looks a little bit informal, let's put it that way. You want your poster to stand out, but you don't want the colour scheme to detract away from your science. So this is hideous, this is okay. This is blue, yellow on blue on dark blue is really good contrast. Colour schemes change throughout the years, and yellow on blue used to be the thing to have about 10 years ago. Now a lot of people are moving back to black text on a white background, but I've seen plenty of posters in this colour scheme and they are hideous to read and you walk away with a migraine, so don't do that. In terms of your layout, and this is very relevant to your assignment, everyone reads a poster from top left to bottom right. So if you have your title at the top, names on the title, have your introduction or abstract, whichever. If you've got an abstract, have it in the top left. If you don't have an abstract, have your introduction in the top left. Methods you would expect to be in the bottom left hand corner. You would want your results bang in the centre, so underneath your title, if you've got 3 columns to your poster, underneath the title in the centre is where your results would ideally start. And your poster is effectively a visual presentation, so you want to make it as easy as possible to understand. And as I showed you on the poster that one of my students presented, having a little schematic diagram of a complex pathway is perfectly okay to have on the poster, and then as the presenting person you would be the person who would be able to explain that pathway. Now I know that you've all done a poster already for reproduction, so you shouldn't have to have detailed instructions on how to use PowerPoint and how to make a poster. If you're doing one for a conference, you would typically print them out at either A0 or A1 size. Always check the size of the poster requirements for a conference. Loads of times I've been to conferences, they say we want a size A1 poster and it has to be in portrait. And then some idiot always turns up with an A0 poster in landscape, and we have poster boards which basically fit an A1 portrait poster. If someone turns up with the wrong size poster, it spreads over onto someone else's poster board and people get a bit irritated and you look unprofessional. So whenever you go to your first conference, really carefully check what are the requirements, what orientation, is it landscape or portrait, is it A0 or A1. And the other tip, if you are presenting a poster, and if we're doing this in person, I would recommend it, is that you print out a load of A4 colour copies of your poster and attach them to your poster so that anyone who's come along to read your poster can take a copy of the poster away with them. If they're particularly interested in it, they often get out the phone and photograph it, but it's much nicer to have a hard copy printed and have your email details on there so that if they're interested in your work they can get in touch with you, because the whole thing about poster presentations, you're chatting to other scientists and you want to be able to make collaborations. So someone might come along, look at your poster, have a chat with you and say this is really interesting, it complements what we're doing, and then they might get in touch in a few weeks' time and propose to work together on a project. And this is how a lot of collaborations are formed between different laboratories. So that's why it's a really good idea to have a printed version of the poster that someone can take away, and then after the meeting on the train home they may well be looking through all of these posters in more detail and may well get in touch with you, and it certainly happened to me in the past, so that's a really good tip. Okay, so normally at this point I'll tell you detailed instructions of where and when you're going to be presenting your poster, what format it is. I'm afraid you're going to have to wait for further details from the PSP1 team on this. Obviously you're not going to be presenting it in poster. I suggested on the chat last week that we may well be doing it by screencasting, so you may well be presenting your poster electronically by screencasting in the way that I'm screencasting this lecture and zooming around your poster and showing us little bits. It may well be that you put your poster together and give us a few hundred words of explanatory text of how everything works. I don't know if we're going to have the joy of asking you questions on your posters or not. This is all down to the PSP1 team to decide exactly how you're going to be assessed, but suffice to say you're going to have to put a poster together, and I'm going to be marking it, so you might as well do it in a style that I particularly like. Okay, well that's your lot.